Hello again, it's the Employee of the Month. And I wanted to take a few minutes and comment on the recent weather event that occurred in Texas last week and the catastrophe that it was. I want to speak to it, and I don't speak to it with an unsympathetic mindset. I'm very empathetic with those who suffered such a weather event. I live in a part of the country wherein hurricanes and tornadoes are fairly common, and we live with the prospect in the spring, summer, and fall of having our homes swept away and all our belongings, or even losing our lives in a catastrophic weather event. So I understand to some degree what Texas went through and those Texans who lost their power, electrical power, during the weather event faced. We've had events here where we've lost power in that same way. However, I want to say that the catastrophe itself is a purely artificial one. In other words, it's not a catastrophe that the weather was so cold. What's a catastrophe is the fact that the electrical grid was incapable of withstanding the load requirements for people to heat their homes during the weather event. That's the catastrophe, and that is a purely artificial catastrophe. We were told by those who marched in front of the cameras as politicians, parading the new priesthood of scientists in their lab coats, that climate change was responsible for this catastrophe. Well, that's simply a lie. How do I know that? Well, it's nothing to go back into the records of Texas meteorological conditions over the last, say, 100 years and see that there have been many times in Texas's history in which it has been this cold in the winter. What a shock. Winter and it's cold. What separates this event is the fact that the power grid was overcome by people trying to heat their homes along with everything else that goes on with the power grid, and that the power grid was insufficient. Why did that occur? It occurred because we've got politicians whom we elected who are no more concerned about things that are important, like the infrastructure of the power grid, than they are concerned about other things that they think are more important. Why are these other things important to them? Well, they're important because they gain face time on television. Television news is all about ratings. If we can get some controversial subject in front of the viewers, then we'll get good ratings, and advertising will make more money for our network, and all will be well. Meanwhile, politicians and their experts can stand in front of us and lie about the fact of why this is happening in Texas. If the electrical grid had been sufficiently capacious to withstand the load, and it should have been, that was brought to the electrical grid via all the people who were trying to heat their homes during this cold snap, this would have just been the weather. The Weather Channel probably would have given it no more than 4 or 5 minutes to make declarations about this is probably one of the coldest winters or coldest times in February that we've seen in X number of years, and then they would have gone to commercial, because that would have been the end of it. But because of the power grid failure, it became a catastrophe. Politicians are very zealous to do whatever they can to get face time on television, like the Mueller report regarding Russiagate, or like any number of easy, low-hanging fruit. I remember back in the 90s, the tobacco industry being gone after for revenue by all these states, where they were going to take that money and spend it toward all sorts of programs to get people to stop smoking. Of course, none of that was true. It was just a way to go get access to a bunch of billions of dollars that they could use for other things. Here we are, people still smoke. I haven't seen all of these wondrous advertisements or anything else that was supposed to stop that the politicians promised us. What politicians are elected to do is to do that for us collectively, which we cannot do for ourselves individually, like the power grid infrastructure. I know a person right now who is an expert. There's an expert in power generation. and what the grid actually can do east of the Mississippi. And I asked him a simple question. I said, based upon your graphs and charts and your studies, if we were to electrify a quarter of the cars in the United States next week, what would happen? He said flatly, the power grid would fail because the generation capacity nor the carrying capacity is there to withstand that many things being placed upon the grid to charge vehicles. That many people trying to charge cars would simply overwhelm the grid immediately. Why is that? Well, it's because politicians have not seen fit to do the things that we elected them to do. No, it has become all about what can gain them face time on television, what can make them popular with particular groups of people that they pander to, not what's really good for the country, like building some nuclear power plants, increasing our grid capacity, increasing the robustness of the grid such that it can withstand such things. That's what we elect politicians to do, to be concerned about the things that we ourselves as individuals cannot do anything about as individuals. And yet, what do we see? We don't see that. We see them blaming what is their responsibility on climate change, wherein had the grid been able to withstand this onslaught of all these people trying to heat their homes, what a terrible thing for them to just want to heat their homes, then this would have just been a weather event with no further conversation about it. People would have remembered, boy, wasn't it cold that week in February in Texas. And there would have been no conversations about the catastrophe that ensued. That catastrophe is laid right at the doorstep of the politicians who have seen fit to not pay any attention to that which we elected them to pay attention to for us. That is why. But, after all, I am merely the employee of the month, passing these things along for your consideration. Thank you so much for your attention.